absolutely zero atmosphere, the easiest boss fight of all time, the most hated Cold War zombies map. After the complete reboot of Zombies, it had been aligned with a totally new Call of Duty audience, everything was looking positive, right? So what happened with Firebase Z? Many fans believe it really didn't live up to the hype, but was it honestly as bad as the community believed? Although Firebase Z definitely has its problems, I personally don't think that point of view applies to the map's wonder weapon, the Rai K-84. Over the years, this badass looking piece of kit has developed a pretty negative collection of opinions from many in the zombies community, but I'm not one of them. I genuinely love this wonder weapon, I think it's fantastic. No, it probably doesn't come anywhere close to my favourite of all time and honestly isn't even the best in Cold War, however that doesn't mean I don't really enjoy using it. There's just something so satisfying about shredding through zombies with a laser rifle. I'm always a huge sucker for any new version of the ray gun, not only because of the lore of these hugely nostalgic weapons, but also because Treyarch always manages to do them so well. It even has a pretty awesome secondary fire type which harks back to a weapon we saw previously in the original Ether story. You essentially drop a ball of energy that you could then spray out in order to overload it, which completely obliterates zombies. Could the primary fire type of the Rai K do with being a little bit more powerful? Absolutely, I won't disagree with the community on that one, but it being slightly underpowered is not enough for me to dislike the weapon. Fortunately for anyone who is a fan, there's also a whole host of ways to get hold of this thing in Firebase Z. Feeling a little bit lazy? Just save up some points and hit the mystery box in order to grab it. Looking for a challenge? Just activate the trial system, make it all the way to legendary, and you can access it as a reward for your hard work. But if you're a fan of classic zombie quests, Firebase Z has you covered too, as there's also a pretty cool side easter egg in order to guarantee that you'll get the Rai K-84 if you're a fan of it like myself. And we've got to talk about how in the game's lore, this wonder weapon is most likely based on early concepts of the ray gun Mark III from Gorod Krovi. But of course in this universe diverged away from that well-known weapon and instead uses Ethereum technology. Which is why of course the secondary fire of the Rai K is very reminiscent of that much loved weapon. This is not a detail that needed to exist in Firebase Z in any way, shape or form, but I'm so glad the devs included it because it's an incredible callback to Black Ops 3 and helps tie the Dark Ether universe to the older story that everyone knows and loves. The Rai K-84 can of course be incredibly useful for taking down the brand new enemy of the map, the Mimic. Okay, let's get one thing clear. Many years after Cold War Zombies, the Mimic would become pretty overused, appearing in a number of maps and even entirely different game modes. But with Firebase Z being its first ever appearance, I think we have to judge it differently here. Generally, I'm always pretty happy with a new mini-boss enemy in COD Zombies, with a few exceptions of course. It's always good to have something new and interesting to take on after many years of training the Horde, and so the Mimic's arrival in this map was definitely a good thing, even if it would become a bit annoying many years later. Visually, this thing looks great, appearing genuinely intimidating and looking pretty disgusting. And it can honestly pose a bit of a threat with the ability to pull players towards it, which can cause you some problems if you get caught in a horde of zombies. I personally would have liked it to be a bit harder to kill and have it show up less often, but that issue isn't enough to make me dislike its appearance in Firebase Z. They also actually have an extremely unique gameplay mechanic that had never been seen up to this point, essentially acting as a surprise enemy by disguising themselves as various things around the map. Although disliked by many, I actually think this feature is very interesting and a hugely unique way to cause zombie players some problems. There is unfortunately a well-known Easter egg step that heavily features these enemies in this mechanic that we'll get onto later though, that does undermine their inclusion in this map slightly. But I wouldn't say that affects the quality of the enemy overall. They're actually not the only controversial thing on this map, as you could definitely say the same about the very well-known defense rounds that you also get on Firebase Z. This is 100% another aspect of the map that a large portion of the zombies community hugely dislike, but again, I'm not one of them. I actually believe that this very unique mechanic brings something fresh and interesting to the game that can totally break up the normal flow of a zombies game, but in a good way. It very much reminds me of the Templar zombies on Origins who could wipe out generators, except this time around it feels like a genuine challenge and is very visually impressive. Don't get me wrong, this idea is far from perfect and definitely has some issues, with a failure dishing out some pretty rough consequences, even going as far as to block your access to certain features until you get the power back on. but I don't have anywhere near as much of a problem with this gameplay mechanic as many others do. I do however think it could be vastly improved, as the main problem with it is that it is 100% forced upon you regardless of whether you actually want to take on the challenge. This mechanic would have worked much better if players had the option to activate a defense objective themselves in order to take on a challenge and get some really useful rewards. With that said though, I do appreciate its inclusion in the map nonetheless, as fresh mechanics and attempts at new features are very often a good thing in my eyes. Something else that was heavily criticised by the community over the years, which I actually don't agree with, is the map layout. It was described as boring and basic by people, and although I wouldn't say it's anything other than fairly simple, I don't necessarily see that as a problem. Sometimes very simple layouts for zombies maps can be pretty boring, but for some reason I don't find this to be the case with Firebase Z. It's certainly not the most extravagant map layout I've ever seen and doesn't have anything on the more top tier experiences in COD Zombies history, but sometimes something a little bit more simple can be fun, and it honestly reminds me of Ascension in a very good way. Once you teleport in from the spawn area, which is actually something we'll get onto later, you then have the choice of 3 different paths to take in order to access various areas of the map. Each has their own ether reactor which needs to be activated and certain perks that you can get hold of. The separate sections may not be massively varied, but I do appreciate the more simple system in this map, as it makes traversing Firebase Z very easy and not massively time consuming. There are occasions in COD Zombies where I think a more basic and simple map design is a mistake, D-Machine being one of those, as it feels like it's missing something, but in Firebase Z I just don't see it like that. Would the map being bigger than it is improve it? Possibly. But it's not something that I think was 100% needed, as the 3-section system here actually makes for a pretty satisfying experience in my opinion. Unfortunately, there are quite a few positives here, and we can luckily add in the story for Firebase Z too. Let's get one thing straight, the narrative of this map is not going to win any Oscars, nor is it going to reach the heights of certain other entries into the Zombies franchise, but it's a clear improvement on the complete lack of narrative on display with D-Machine. The addition of certain on-map characters such as Peck and Ravenov really help to tell a much more cohesive story and actually allow you to feel like you're part of something bigger with more in-depth plot lines. To some degree, it still suffers from some of the same issues as D-Machine due to the fact that you're merely playing as an operator, so you do often feel very much like an extra in someone else's movie, but overall it's definitely stronger than the Cold War Zombies launch map. The narrative is definitely helped by certain cutscenes present in the map that appear as part of the Easter egg that we'll get onto shortly, because they really do add to the overarching story of Cold War and actually make you feel like what you're doing is having genuine in-world consequences. As mentioned though, we can't kid ourselves and suggest that the story on display here is to the level of things like Ether or Chaos, but credit where it's due, as this is a huge improvement over the previous map and should be praised for that. However, it's no secret, as I've mentioned, that Firebase Z is a map that has been very controversial over the years in the eyes of zombie fans, and there are many valid reasons as to why they feel like that. After the D-Machine Easter egg was considered pretty simple and not particularly challenging, then surely the devs would up the ante for Firebase Z, right? Yeah, not really. Unfortunately, just like Cold War's launch map, it's just not really difficult enough. The vast majority of steps are fairly simple and can be done on the first try without too much effort. The quest does have some cool parts, including the lockdown in one of the defense areas. This at least provides some level of challenge, even if it's not hugely difficult. But most of the main quest is never going to test the more highly skilled zombie players, and just like D-Machine, seems to lean a little bit too closely to a much more casual Easter egg. Well, that is apart from one infamous step that is hated even numerous years after the map first landed, and I've got to say I agree with those opinions. The mimic step is absolutely infuriating, and sure, no doubt the average answer for this is skill issue, but if after many years of people playing this still causes them some problems, then maybe it was just poorly thought out. Having to capture mimics is not a difficult thing to do. It was in fact a very interesting idea that I actually liked, it's just the inconsistency of it that's kind of mind-blowing. It has to be a very specific mimic that spawns only in certain areas containing tons of fake loot on the ground. This may sound simple, but it's not, it's a nightmare. Mimics spawning in other places essentially cancel out the ability to get the right one for the Easter egg. They can spawn and then you lose track of which is the right one. You can be forever collecting this enemy in the trap over and over again, transporting it to the station on the map and repeatedly finding out it's useless because it gives you no indicator if it's even the right one to begin with. It's not the idea of the step that's bad, it's the implementation of it, as sadly it just feels like it was either very poorly thought out or designed specifically to annoy players. Outside of this, the main quest is very straightforward and honestly a bit too short. It sadly suffers from the same problem as D-Machine, with the Easter egg just not being in depth enough for long-term zombie fans. But of course, if you were new to the scene at the time, I could understand how something a bit more simple would have been great for you. But if we're talking about things that are simple, then wow, we've got to cover that boss fight. Because this could well be the easiest one in COD Zombies history. It doesn't really consist of anything more than just spraying the Order in the face as much as possible with your strongest weapon. Sure, you have to deal with zombies and boss enemies at the same time, but you have a decently sized area to do that in, so it's honestly just not too tough. Couple the complete lack of challenge with the fact that it just takes place in the spawn area, not even a unique boss arena, and you have a recipe for a pretty weak encounter. Oh, did I mention you can actually end up fighting this very same boss during one of the defense rounds, which understandably just makes the final fight even more underwhelming due to this not even being the first time you've encountered this beast. There's unfortunately just nothing special about this final boss whatsoever. If players had never seen it before, fought the Order in a completely new special looking arena, and had to take on a well thought out encounter with unique attacks and crazy phases of various levels of danger, then sure, it could have been great. But at that point, that's just a completely different boss fight that I've created in my own head. Sure, this boss fight is better than none at all, and I have to say I honestly think I'd rather take on the Order than get involved in what we can't even really call a boss fight from the end of D Machine. But with that said, I can't sit here and suggest that this final encounter is anything other than very disappointing. As I mentioned, it weirdly takes place in the spawn area, and whilst we're talking about that area, we need to get a little bit more in depth with it. Upon launching into the map, this place is actually really impressive. Visually it looks great and it has a lot of very useful things. An armor machine, the Wonder Fizz, Pack-a-Punch and a quick revive machine. The only problem is you can't access half of it until you've turned the power on. And you realise quickly that this is merely a starting area and you actually need to teleport into the real Firebase. At first glance, this is really cool and an interesting way to start, the match kind of reminding me of Moon. It's only later though, as you progress to higher rounds, that you realise how annoying this setup is. Once the power's on and you can finally Pack-a-Punch, you need to return to the starting area. Then you get more points and you want to Pack-a-Punch again, you need to return to the starting area. You want to start the Easter egg by talking to Ravenov, you need to return to the starting area. You want to use the Wonder Fizz machine, you need to return to the starting area. And then many times throughout the main quest, you need to return to... You see where I'm going with this, right? I could do it all day. Having to constantly teleport back into spawn to do these things gets old fast. Now, it's not some major issue that automatically makes the map terrible, it's just annoying and gets pretty frustrating. You could probably class this as more of a nitpick than a serious problem, but either way, I feel like this system could have been planned out far better. When you think about it though, there's a very simple reason as to why this is the case. The spawn area has a lot of these important things, for example the Wonder Fizz machine, because this is where the boss fight takes place, so if you go down you can buy whatever perks you want again. So realistically, if Firebase Z just had a unique place to actually take on the Order final encounter, then you wouldn't need to have machines like this in the spawn area. I genuinely love when the devs try new things in zombies, so I'm pretty much always down for a bit of experimentation, but I also think you've got to call it out when it just doesn't work, and this is one of those situations. Unfortunately, it's not the only thing that doesn't really land properly in Firebase Z, as you could definitely say the same for the atmosphere. Well, actually, what atmosphere? It might seem a bit harsh to say, but it's pretty much non-existent. Earlier I compared this map to Ascension in terms of the map layout, but sadly that doesn't extend to the atmosphere because it just doesn't really exist on Firebase Z. Visually, I don't think the experience looks bad at all, and I very much enjoy the old dirty rundown military base theme, but what it really needs is that extra level of creepiness to really hammer the theme home. That is exactly what Ascension got right with its tone and vibe, which is helped by the fact that the map does not take place in bright sunlight like Firebase Z, which is probably something that holds it back slightly in the atmosphere department. A daytime zombies map is not automatically a recipe for a bad setting. It often just makes it much more difficult for it to feel like a true classic zombies experience in terms of atmosphere, and also sometimes makes it hard for fans to feel like they're playing a truly unnerving experience. And this, along with a number of things I've already mentioned, just makes it very tough for Firebase Z to stand out in an ever-growing list of COD Zombies maps. But it leaves us with one big question: is it really as bad as the zombies community believes? Over the many years since the release of Cold War Zombies, the community has been extremely vocal about Firebase Z, and the general consensus is pretty clear: it is not well liked at all. Even a lot of the things I've discussed as positive features are considered large negatives by many people, leading to a very disliked map overall. I have to say though, in general, I don't agree with the zombies community's overall consensus on Firebase Z. Yes, it has its problems, yes, it has some rather odd design choices, and yes, there are certainly things I would change about it, but I don't think it deserves anywhere near as much hate as it gets, and shockingly, I'd probably choose to play this experience over D Machine. It can in many ways be quite a frustrating map, but not because of what it offers players, more so because of what could have been. I think with some slight changes to the experience, we could well have been looking at a map that would be considered one of the greats. I always find myself enjoying Firebase Z whenever I jump into it, but it definitely leaves me wondering how the community would have felt if Treyarch had gone in a slightly different direction with it. But I think it's important to note and once again reiterate that this map to me is much stronger than fans think, and I respect the experimentation the devs went for with Firebase Z, if only all of those design choices had worked out just a little bit better.